Hello viewers, I am Dr. Gore Vittal. In this session, we will learn some of the landmarks in the history of British Parliament. It is said that change is the law of nature and everything around us always goes through a phase of change. Human life is not an exception for this law. Any change basically puts in the picture of the basic difference between the previous and the new. So, the human life is. British people are known for their traditional approach and rigidity for customs and lifestyle. These aspects reflect in their day-to-day life, but their intellectual, social and political development was consistent and parallel. The phase of parliamentary reforms positively affected the life of the British people. Similarly, their perpetual demand for the right to vote itself proved to be a big struggle. In this lesson, you will learn three major acts which brought reforms in British parliamentary democracy and equally changed the fate of the people in the country. The Reform Acts. The British democracy has gone through many changes in the course of time. One such change was the reform of Parliament, which has a perpetual influence on the people of Great Britain and the British democracy as well. Approximately by 1830, it had been quite evident that the lower house in the British Parliament, that is the House of Commons, needed reforms in terms of regional representation. There was a common perception among the citizens that the House was not representing the masses and it was unable to deal with the social, economical and regional problems caused by the Industrial Revolution. The bad condition of towns, the countryside factories and the mines in England and Scotland were the major concerns. In addition, the right to vote, that is the franchise, became major sentimental issue for the people, which had changed the entire social and political scenario. Due to the constant demand of the masses and disparate need of the representation of the newly developed towns and communities, the process of reformation started. In British history, the reforms took place with three different acts which were passed by the British Parliament. The names given to the three most important constitutional measures were called the Reform Acts of 1832, 1867 and 1884. The acts have offered representation to the newly developed towns, communities and to the masses in the British Parliament. The Reform Acts of 1832, 1867 and 1884 extended voting rights to the middle and lower class people in Great Britain. Social and political scenario. The representation in the British Parliament was not rational and judicious. The representation by the squires and aristocrats was the major concern of the common people. The boroughs like Old Sarum, which had 7 voters who were controlled by the local squires, were sending 2 members to the Parliament. The members of Parliament were mostly the landlords, aristocratic people and industrialists who got ample representation in both the houses of parliament, that is, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Various acts passed by those members of parliament extended benefits only to the upper classes. The system was corrupt and had no scope for the improvement and development of the masses. The newly developed large cities like Manchester and Birmingham had no representatives of their own. Out of a population of multi-millions in the British Isles, including Ireland, only about 435,000 were qualified to vote. Corruption and the sale of seats flourished. Reform agitation beginning to develop in the 1760s was supported by William Pitt and others, but the emergency period of the French Revolution interrupted it. It again revived in 1807 and had become the leading issue by 1830. This social and political scenario had long-lasting impact on the people who were inspired by the French Revolution and started agitation for their fundamental demand like social, economical and political security. There were logically unfair practices which created restlessness among the common people in Great Britain. The section given below will describe some of the important terms used in the unfair and irrational old political system. Franchise. It meant to have the right to vote. Ballot. Ballot was the paper giving someone the right to vote for a candidate in an election. Candidate means the person who is contesting election. Hustings means the platform from which a candidate casts his vote. Land tax. Land tax means a tax imposed on land or a property. Nominate. To nominate means to propose a candidate for election. Open burg. It means a burg where the number of voters was too great to make it possible for a rich candidate to bribe enough of the electorate to secure an election victory. Urban. It refers to a town or a city. Rural. It refers to the countryside. Radical. It means someone in favor of extreme social and parliamentary reforms. And corruption, when someone tries to bribe and or otherwise cheat the system for gain. These were the various terms which were in practice in the old political system. The first Reform Act of 1832 proved to be very controversial, but a stepping stone in the history of British Parliament. It had reappointed the representation in the Parliament in a fair way to the countryside, towns, cities, industrial zones and common people belonging to different strata of society. This act brought a revolutionary change in British history. It did not offer representation to the common people, but also gave power to the lower classes in the social and economical scale. It extended right to vote to any man who owns a property worth £10. In the course of time, the memories of French Revolution were faded up. The first 3 decades created restlessness and anxiety among the common people for their fundamental right to vote. There was growing acceptance that some parliamentary reform was necessary to tackle the situation. The unequal distribution of seats, the extension of the franchise, and rotten boroughs were the issues to be addressed. In this regard, Eric Hobsbawm writes in his book Industry and Empire, The Birth of the Industrial Revolution, about this political and social unrest. I quote, "No period of British history has been as tense, as politically and socially disturbed as the 1830s and early 1840s, when both the working class and the middle class separately or in conjunction demanded what they regarded as fundamental changes. From 1829 to 1832, their discontents fused in the demand of parliamentary reform, behind which the masses threw their riots and demonstrations. The businessmen, the power of economic boycott. After the 1832, when several of the demands of the middle class radicals were met, the workers' movement fought and failed alone. In 1830, the Tory government ruled the country. The Prime Minister, Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, was resolutely opposed to parliamentary reform. However, there was growing support for limited change within his own party, primarily because partially extending the franchise to middle and lower classes would allow the wealth and influence of Britain, which would also allow growing the middle class and lower class people. When the Tory government was driven out later in 1830, Earl Grey, a Whig, became the Prime Minister and pledged to carry out parliamentary reforms. The Whig party was pro-reform, and though 2 reform bills failed to be carried in Parliament, the third was successful and received royal assent in 1832. The bill was passed due to Lord Grey's plan to persuade King William IV to consider using his constitutional powers to create additional Whig peers in the House of Lords to guarantee the passage for the bill. On hearing of this plan, Tory peers abstained from voting, thus allowed the bill to be passed, but avoided the creation of more Whig peers in the Parliament of Great Britain. The Representation of the People Act 1832, known as the First Reform Act or Great Reform Act. Some silent features of the Act. The Reform Act simplified the registration and voting process. The Reform Act cancelled the franchise rights of 56 boroughs in England and Wales. The Reform Act reduced another 30 boroughs, and less than 4,000 habitants lost 1 member of Parliament each. Weymouth and Melcombe Regis gave up 2 of their 4 members of Parliament. The Reform Act created 67 new constituencies all over the country. The Reform Act broadened the franchise property qualification criteria to include small landowners, tenants, farmers and shopkeepers, etc. The Reform Act created a uniform franchise in the boroughs, and the Reform Act also gave right to vote to all the householders who paid yearly rental of £10 or more. These clauses in the Reform Act had brought a radical change, but to begin with, it proved to be very much instrumental. The clause like possessing some property and being eligible for franchise prohibited majority of working men who could not vote. Key features of the Reform Act 1832. No woman was allowed to vote. The ability to vote relied on ownership of land. There was no secret ballot and members of parliament still bribed voters. Half of the rotten boroughs lost their members of parliament, but 73 retained after the Reform Act. The number of people who could vote increased by 50%. The industrial towns such as Manchester, Liverpool and Sheffield got their own members of parliament, and the number of members of parliament for southern England was still disproportionately high. The Reform Act of 1867. After the first successful attempt in the Reform Act of 1832 to reform Britain's electoral process, the second attempt was made in 1867. The Reform Act of 1867 was the further redistribution of the seats in the House of Commons, doubled the electorate in England and Wales to almost 2 million and gave voting rights to many working men in the towns and cities. It was properly titled as the Representation of the People Act 1867. The working class people were yet to be offered the right to vote. Their constant demand put on some pressure on the government. In addition, the growth and influence of Chartist movement started from 1838 was an indication that parliamentary reforms were needed. By 1850, Chartist movement picked up and there was an acceptance among the members of parliament that there was more work to be done to remove irregularities in the system, which were not addressed by the first Reform Act of 1832. In March 1860, Lord John Russell introduced a Parliamentary Reform Act which would reduce the qualification criteria for right to vote to £10 in the counties and £6 in towns. Then, the Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, opposed the bill, resulting Russell's efforts in vain. In July 1865, Palmerston passed away. Earl Russell became the Prime Minister. Russell made one more attempt to pass the bill, but once again he failed, which was followed by his resignation in June 1866. The new leader of Liberal Party, William Gladstone, had the same ideology and announced that he would be in favor of the parliamentary reforms. The new Prime Minister, Lord Derby, basically a conservative, who had Benjamin Disraeli as his Chancellor of Exchequer. In 1867, Benjamin Disraeli proposed a new Reform Act. The Act enfranchised 150,000 men, all male urban householders and male lodgers for unfurnished accommodation, got the right to vote. Some other features of the Act are as follows. the key features of the Reform Act of 1867. The Act did not address one man, one vote demand, which was resisted by the Parliament. Women were again denied the fundamental right to vote. The Act granted vote to all householders in the boroughs and the tenants who paid a rent of about £10 a year or more. It reduced the property threshold in the counties and gave the voting right to the agricultural landowners and tenants with very small amount of land. Men in urban areas who met the property qualification criteria were also offered the fundamental right to vote. The Act doubled the electorate in England and Wales from 1 million to 2 million men. The Act dealt with the constituencies and boroughs with less than 10,000 inhabitants, lost one of their members of Parliament. The 45 seats left were distributed by giving 15 to towns which had no representation, giving one extra seat to some larger towns like Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham and Leeds, creating a seat for University of London exclusively, and giving 25 seats to the counties which had increased population since 1832. The Reform Act of 1884. The Reform Act of 1884 was the subsequent development in the process of reforms which started in 1832. The Reform Act of 1832 had reappointed the representation in the Parliament in a fair way to the countryside, towns, cities, industrial zones and common people belonging to different strata of society. The Reform Act of 1867 was the further redistribution of the seats in the House of Commons, doubled the electorate in England and Wales to almost 2 million and gave voting rights to many working men in the towns and cities. Whereas, the Reform Act of 1884 removed the distinction between countryside and boroughs franchises. It reduced the qualification criteria for rural people. The leader of Liberal Party, William Gladstone, was of the opinion that their power base was rural England, and any reforms targeting rural areas and right to vote to the countryside people would create a political base for the party. On the contrary, Conservative Party led by Lord Salisbury was against the concept, and further reforms offering a right to vote to any underprivileged classes. Due to the consistent efforts of William Gladstone, the Reform Act of 1884 was passed in the House of Commons, but the bill was rejected by the House of Lords since it was dominated by the Conservative Party having a different opinion about the reforms. Gladstone continued his perseverance for the cause and had an agreement with the Lords to pass the bill. House of Lords passed the bill only when Gladstone agreed that 1884 Reform Act would be followed by a redistribution bill. William Gladstone passed the Reform Act of 1884 and added about 20 million men to the electorate. This act gave voting rights to the agricultural labourers. By the third Reform Act, right to vote had become a real fundamental constitutional right than the sole property of the privileged. In the third attempt in the process of reform, women were disappointed and were denied any voting rights. The Reform Act of 1867 had been very extensive, so the subsequent needed a little change. 1867 Act concentrated on urban areas. On the other hand, the 1884 Act was purposeful for the rural areas. A few areas which were not addressed by the 1867 Act were targeted by the 1884 Reform Act. The Reform Act of 1884 gave the counties equal voting rights as compared to the boroughs. All adult householders and men rented for unfurnished lodgings to the value of £10 a year were also given the right to vote. The electorate after this act stood at 55 million, but it did not offer any relief to women and kept 40% of all men still deprived from the right to vote because of their status in the society. Key features of the Reform Act of 1884. The Reform Act of 1884 added about 20 million men to the electorate. The Act gave voting rights to the agricultural labourers. The Act gave the counties equal voting rights as compared to the boroughs. All adults, householders and men who rented unfurnished lodgings to the value of £10 a year were also given right to vote. The electorate after this act stood at 55 million. The act kept 40% of all men still deprived from right to vote because of their status within the society. The act did not offer any relief to women this time as well. The right to vote was never been liberally granted to common people in England. A majority of the people were deprived of their fundamental rights as the result of their social and financial status in the society. The great reform bills of 1832, 1867 and 1884 were passed in the Parliament not in response to any riots, pressure, assaults or any alliance. They were the need of the time. The political parties took it to their convenience for political benefits, but as a whole it extended perpetual advantages to the masses who were deprived of their fundamental right to vote. I hope you have understood different phases of parliamentary reforms in British democracy, which has changed the life of millions. See you once again in the next session. Thank you.